Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs here at CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And today we're going to discuss the United States' past efforts to decouple supply chains in satellite technology and what implications they may have for export control and trade policy today. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. We're holding this seminar for the first time in hybrid format with folks here in the room as well as folks online. For those of you online, if you experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. We'll be coming back to it during the Q&A to take your questions, and we'll take some questions from folks in the room as well. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. Martin Rasser is a senior fellow and director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS. Before joining CNAS, he served as a senior intelligence officer and analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, where he worked on foreign emerging technologies, technology innovation, and weapons research and development. He also served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, special advisor to a senior military commander in the Middle East, chief counterterrorism liaison to a U.S. military unit in Iraq, and vice chairman of a National Intelligence Council working group. Upon leaving government service, he was chief of staff at Muddy Waters Capital, an investment research firm. More recently, he was director of analysis at Kindi, a venture-backed AI startup in Silicon Valley. Martin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Well, hello, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here at CSET, and it's a great honor to be here with Emily Weinstein and Tim Wang, the authors of a very thought-provoking issue brief, which I encourage you all to read if you haven't had the chance to already. So what we'll do now is Emily and Tim will give you a presentation about their research, and after that, we'll open it up to Q&A, which I'm very much looking forward to. So over to you, Emily and Tim.
All right, so today Tim and I are going to be discussing, as Martin said, a report that we wrote earlier this year that tries to apply some historical case studies or historical context to the conversation around decoupling. And we're going to be specifically talking about a case study involving the US satellite industry. So with that, just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. We'll start obviously with the historical case study that we just mentioned, as well as then go into the implications for artificial intelligence. We'll round out everything with an overview of what our findings mean in the context of the latest export controls that have come out about 2 weeks ago now on semiconductors and semiconductor production equipment. And then looking forward to Q&A. So with that, I'll pass it to Tim to kind of give an introduction of the project.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everybody. Very glad to see many faces in person that I've only seen kind of as talking heads on screen. So glad to be here. So there's really two things that we're trying to get done with this paper. And one of the sort of motivations for writing it was first to fight what we'd call kind of ahistoricality in the discussion around export controls and sort of decoupling more generally. So typically when we talk about decoupling in the context of something like AI, I think the eye is inevitably drawn towards the AI part of that. And I think we frequently forget that sort of export controls are a long-standing tool of economic statecraft. And so that when you end up in a conference conversation where someone's like, what is the effect of export control on artificial intelligence? The response of the paper is simply to say, well, we've sort of been here before, right? And so the satellite case study that Emily mentioned that she'll be going into really is kind of the sort of anchor for the paper. We simply start by saying, look, if we're wondering about what we think the long-term impact will be of trying to attempt to decouple an export control sense in AI, we can simply look to the fact that there's a period of sort of intense trading cooperation around space and satellite technologies in China, and then those were decoupled, right? And so the kind of one brain cell thing to do is like maybe that gives us some hints about what's happening going forwards. So on the next slide, the second thing that we are trying to get done with this paper is really to kind of clarify means and ends when it comes to the discussion around export controls, right? So export controls can be used for all sorts of purposes, right? You may be concerned that a technology is being used to violate human rights, right, in a way that you're really concerned about. That's one potential means, or one potential ends. Another end might be that you're trying to protect the competitiveness of U.S. industry, right? That's another end. But I think typically in this discussion, if you've been close to it, a lot of these ends kind of all get mashed together, right? And they're like, we need to export control to compete better. And I think one of the things that we want to do with the paper is to get that conversation to become a little bit more nuanced, to say, what is it that we're really trying to achieve with export controls? The other thing we're trying to do is also nuance the discussion around means as well, right? So, I think one of the reasons, I was joking with a friend recently, that I think a lot of policymakers like export controls is that they feel really cool, right? You put this policy down and there's immediately ripple impacts that go across the entire economy. And I think what we want to say is that maybe this is the wrong hammer to be swinging at every single nail. And that one of the bits of nuance that we want to bring to the discussion is to say, okay, are there attributes of certain technologies that make them more or less amenable to export controls as a lever? And can we look to history to try to ascertain what are the attributes of those technologies, right? And so in doing so, the idea is to really kind of help to narrow the context in which we choose to use export controls, i.e. the ends, and then the specific technologies we decide to do them for, right? The narrowing the means on how the policy is deployed. And so I'll come back to talk a little bit about the kind of AI side of this, but to give a little bit of framework, Emily will talk about the sort of satellite case study here.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead to talking about, like Tim said, the kind of broader context of this historical case study. We've got here one slide that has tried to mash about 40 years of history into one. And I want to emphasize there are obviously many things that have happened in between these periods, and this is not supposed to be a comprehensive timeline of everything that's happened during this time period. But there are a few really interesting points that I want to highlight. So starting with before 1970, you'll see there's one piece that says from 1960 to around 1970, the Chinese were really forced to rely on their indigenous capabilities. And this was actually further emphasized via the Sino-Soviet split, when the Chinese had previously depended very heavily on the Soviet Union for a lot of its technology. As the kind of relationship there started to decline, the Chinese found themselves kind of stuck, relying on their own capabilities. But things started to change, obviously, with the normalization of US-China relations in 1979. Actually, in January of 1979, just the first month after they had normalized relations, Deng Xiaoping actually came to the United States and visited NASA's Johnson Space Center in Texas. For those who know the famous picture of Deng Xiaoping at the rodeo with his little cowboy hat on, that was during that same visit. And I want to emphasize again that this, within the first month of normalizing relations, collaboration in space technology was really a key part of this relationship, with obviously visiting a NASA center. So that's kind of the early period. So if we go into the middle of the timeline, we can see that from about 1980 through to, I would say, about the middle of the 1990s, we see a period of I wouldn't necessarily call it détente, but I would say that it was a period of significant collaboration between the US and China in space technology. So we have a few examples of not only satellite exports from the United States being approved to be sold to China, but also Chinese companies first offering launch services to companies and entities in Europe as well. We saw this period actually also, despite kind of other geopolitical challenges, we saw space continue to be a really important part of the US-China relationship. So many folks in this room know, obviously, something happened in China in June of 1989. We had the Tiananmen Square massacre. And following that, there was an influx of US government sanctions and export controls on various leadership in the Chinese Communist Party and other parts of the Chinese government as a result of that. But even despite those changes, we actually saw space collaboration continue. And you'll note that little bracket up there actually shows that both the Clinton administration and the Bush 1 administration issued a total of about 13 waivers for space technology collaborations, particularly in satellites, to continue despite other ongoing restrictions. The kind of culmination of all this, I would say, so we see in 1993 that the commercial satellites, or that satellites were moved actually from being deemed munitions in the US government legal definition to being deemed commercial dual use items. And this, for those who are kind of the export control nerds here, it's again moving things from the ITAR to the export administration regulations. And what this ostensibly did in 1993 was make it a lot easier for US companies to export satellites and related components overseas. Then, we have what is the kind of the turning point, I would say, in the US-China space relationship in 1998 with the Loral-Hughes incident, which I'll talk about in just a moment, as well as 1999 kind of being the end of US-China space collaboration with the publication of the Cox report and the 1999 National Defense Authorization Act, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So that's kind of, again, 40 years of history squashed into about a 2-minute spiel. So forgive me if I left things out, but those are kind of the really important pieces here. But I want to talk again, I mentioned those two really specific turning points. The first one being the Loral-Hughes incident in 1998. So Loral Space and Communications and Hughes Electronics Corporation are two still in existence space and satellite communications companies that were working in China as they were, taking U.S. satellites and related components, bringing them over to China, and Chinese companies were then offering launch services to U.S. companies like these two. So it turned out that on a kind of, as with these things, there were a few incidents where there were maybe some failures to launch or something didn't go right in around like 1996, 1997. And so Loral and/or Hughes sent a insurance rep over to China to say, okay, look, I want to get some information on why this failed. We want to get our money back. And that insurance investigation actually turned into something much greater that resulted actually in April 1998, a public investigation by the Department of Justice was initiated. And these were criminal investigations as the insurance report that was actually passed over to the Department of Justice revealed two really important things, and those are those two bullets up there. So it revealed that the two companies had potentially, and it's, no one says it's their, well, people will say it's their fault. There's no kind of evidence as to whether or not it was a purposeful or nefarious sharing of information. They were just sharing sensitive technical information on guidance systems with the Chinese engineers that they were working with. And what the DOJ investigation argued was that the information that was shared with these Chinese scientists and engineers allegedly allowed for the improvement in accuracy and reliability of Chinese missiles, which in the context of US national competitiveness or US military competitiveness was very much something that folks were worried about. So what was the response? The response was the formation of the Cox Committee, named after the member of Congress who was in charge of that committee. And what this committee did, and for nerds like me who really want to go out and read this report, it is online, it is public. You can buy a physical copy of it if you really want to read it like a book.
Which you have.
I do have it, and it is fascinating bedtime reading. What this report really did, it was probably one of the first public, very detailed reports on issues related to technology transfer with the People's Republic of China. Obviously, it went beyond the Loral-Hughes incident, but there's an entire section dedicated specifically to what happened there, what was found, what the potential technical information that was shared led to in China, and what this report did. And so this was the culmination of a group of members of Congress that came together, wrote this Cox report. And this led to a big change in the 1999 National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, that as a result of what happened here, it moved commercial satellites back. So as you can see, if I go back one slide, or two slides here. So in 1993, where it says that that satellites were moved from being deemed munitions to being deemed commercial dual-use items, it was actually reversed in the 1999 NDAA, and they were moved back to being considered munitions, which obviously means that there are much more intense and strict regulations around their export. So as we can see, so in 1999, ostensibly what changed, commercial satellites and their related components became legally defined as defense articles as opposed to commercial dual-use items. So that's kind of the big history here. So what are the lessons? What are the takeaways? So Tim kind of mentioned these early on, but I'm going to pull them out and apply them, I would say, specifically to this case here. But what we saw was first this one lesson about the idea of decoupling, or in this case, export controls, as a strategy for imposing delay. So we can see, now we're sitting 20 plus years after the policy change in the 1999 NDAA. And pretty much everyone in the room and most people watching online would probably argue that China has indeed emerged as a leading player in space technology despite US efforts. Ooh. There we go. So why has this happened? How has this happened if we did all of these things to try and prevent this? One is this idea that key components and expertise actually came from outside of the United States. The US is not the only country that is working on satellite technology or is working on space technology. So Chinese engineers and scientists were able to learn and acquire necessary information from other sources, other countries, you name it. The other piece of this is the fact that this policy move in 1999 was a unilateral policy. And this actually, now with hindsight, we argue that this might have actually inhibited US progress, allowing China to catch up more quickly. Because what this did was really isolate the US market because of these really strict controls, allowing everyone else, and we'll get into kind of some of the implications for competitiveness in just a moment, but allowing everyone else to kind of jump in and fill that gap. And this had a really profound impact, I would say, on the US satellite industry. The second lesson is about this idea of how geographic concentration can influence the effectiveness of decoupling or the effectiveness of export controls. So before the policy change, so before 1999, most of the world relied on the United States for satellite components. So what can we draw from this? One of the things that, again, we'll talk more about this in just a moment with artificial intelligence, but one of the lessons that Tim and I pulled from this was this idea that technologies that have a small number of manufacturers that are concentrated in a handful of countries usually lend themselves more effectively to export controls since there are fewer alternative sources. So there are fewer kind of gaps in the regime. So specifically in the case of satellites, what we saw was that there was, like I said, about alternative sources, we saw that there was sufficient knowledge outside the United States, particularly from Russia and the European Space Agency, which we'll get into that in just a moment. And what this did in isolating the US satellite industry, it actually created a market incentive for some of these alternative sources or alternative countries and companies to develop US free satellite technologies. So technologies that had no US components whatsoever. So the result of this is the growth of non-US, for the technical folks, ITAR free satellites, which again is just a fancy way of saying in this context, satellites that have no US origin components or items and are therefore not subject to US export controls. And so just to kind of paint a picture of the impact of this here. Went too far. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So this is a pie chart actually that is from a fantastic book. And for people who want to educate themselves more on both the US export control system as well as kind of the US-China relationship and technology controls, highly recommend this book by Hugo Meyer, which I've cited here. It's called Trading with the Enemy. This is pulled from his thing. And if we look actually at this pie chart here, we can see that, so if we consider the middle between the two charts to be that year 1999-2000 when the policy change happened, we can see that before then, the US occupied about 73% of the worldwide share of satellite exports. Fast forward 10 years later, 5 years after this policy went into effect, we can see not only did the size of the US share of satellite exports decrease to only 25%, but we see a proliferation of a lot of additional players kind of jumping into this market. And that goes back to this idea of this market incentive to jump in and kind of fill that vacuum that the US companies had left. I want to point out too, for those who have questions on it, the EU in this case refers to the European Space Agency. But so the European Space Agency itself was working on ITAR-free satellites, but we also had companies within countries in the EU, including Italy, Germany, France, also trying to work on their own domestic replacements or domestic satellites to also sell to other folks. So we see here that we kind of forced some of these companies or some of the folks selling stuff here to pick between the US and Chinese markets. And in a lot of cases, folks decided that the market incentives were strong enough to decide to go the opposite direction of the US. So this is a really interesting point. I think it's a really salient case study when we're thinking about decoupling or the effectiveness of export controls today. So I'll pass it to Tim now to talk a little bit more about kind of what this means for AI.
Yeah, definitely. So happy to pick it up. And, as you'll probably see, I think what I love about this case study is that you don't always get the opportunity as a researcher to have a historical case study, which appears to be like so parallel to the situation that we have today. And to just kind of make that argument a little bit explicit, I mean, there's three cases here that I think allow you to basically say there's things that we're learning in the space case that do apply to AI. So the first one, of course, is that like at the center of the space story is a cutting edge capability, right? So I think in terms of technical maturity, we're roughly kind of where AI is now is kind of where satellites were back then, right? So I think there's some analogy you can draw there. A second one is that there's a period in which there is kind of relatively free trade relations occurring between the US and China. And the final one is sort of concerns about competitiveness, right, are creating pressures to close down those things. And so I think because of those three dimensions, I think the argument is, okay, well, there's things that we can learn here in the satellite case that can be applied to AI. And so I think there's two sort of questions that emerge from the lessons that Emily just went through, right? So the first one is that export controls shouldn't be considered a categorical block to rival progress. So really in the satellite case, that's like, okay, well, we hope we can delay your progress in satellites, but hey, looking today, it looks like China has caught up, right? And so I think the main first question that we need to ask is in the AI case, are there special reasons to believe that a delay in rival progress is actually something that is desirable here? And I think on that answer, or that question, I think we land on a yes answer. For me, it really comes down to two arguments. The first one is that you see a lot of these market dynamics playing out in AI that are roughly akin to sort of like the Google story, right? Which is that you have a company that's able to launch some AI capability, it enters the market, it becomes popular. That capability ends up allowing you to gather a lot of data, which allows you to improve your AI system. And so that there is kind of returns to scale to being sort of like the first to market, right? And so if you believe the argument that a lot of power in AI may actually come from private companies within your borders really being sort of experts or leaders in the technology, maybe there's some argument that we're in a special window right now where you may actually want to exert some kind of delay on sort of Chinese progress on AI. The other argument is that we are also in this really interesting period around sort of the geography of talent around the technology. And like a lot of emerging industries, right, I think we're still trying to figure out where are the centers of talent going to be. And another argument is, okay, well, people will flock to where there's most early success in the space, right? In the same way that, Detroit becomes an automobile city over time, in part that's due to the fact that there's a period of time where this is a city that's leading in the technology of automobiles, that it includes or attracts a lot of experts, and that's a return to scale. And so I think for both of those arguments, I think there's good reason to say, okay, AI is a strategic scenario in which you do want to impose a delay, or there's special reasons why this would be really valuable. And so the second question ends up being a matter of means, right? Is export control the right way to impose that delay? And I guess, Emily, you're on the next slide. You always got to keep turning around. And I think this will be kind of maybe a story that a lot of people around CSET have heard before, but I think our paper offers maybe a plot twist that I would love to kind of debate with the audience here, right? So what we do what is by now, I think, a very classic sort of CSET analysis where we say, okay, well, is export control amenable in the AI case? Well, AI consists of these three major inputs: data, algorithms, and hardware. And not surprisingly, you look at the supply chain around data and algorithms and you say, okay, these are spaces where it's really hard to control the asset, right? Data is very fluid. Someone can walk out of a headquarters with a thumb drive and you've kind of lost your control over the data. It's very easily copyable. There's lots of alternatives. This is not going to be a good place by and large for export controls, except in very, very narrow cases. Same thing arguably is the case in algorithms as well, right? So you have OpenAI say, we're a lab that's trying to be responsible. We're going to control your access to this next level language model. And then in a few months, actually, it turns out that open source alternatives are widely available on GitHub, right? So this is, again, kind of like, okay, this is maybe not the best place to exert your export controls. And so I think where a lot of the discussion has turned quite naturally is to say, okay, well, semiconductors, right? These are big, immovable factories. There's only a couple places they're built. Maybe this is a good place to exert sort of your policy lever, right, in exerting this kind of delay. And I think what's interesting, and maybe folks in the room who have been more part of this discussion will find this novel, is that actually we're kind of pouring some water on this argument. That even though semiconductors are attractive, I think there's actually a lot of arguments to believe that it may not actually be ultimately good from the perspective of, again, the ends, which is slowing rival progress in technology. And the argument is really based on three things. One of them is that I think there's a notion in the discussion around AI policy, which is that competitiveness depends on having the model with the biggest training or the biggest parameters, the most data, the most compute, right? But in practice, what we find actually is that a lot of the value of AI is just whether or not you can deploy it practically, say, in the field, right? And so there's actually this very real question where we need to decouple like the training of advanced models from the value they actually provide to a society or a military or a government, right? And I think there's a lot to believe that basically it's not necessarily the training process that will give you that advantage. It will be your ability to deploy, right? And if that's the case, then putting export controls on semiconductors is not going to be your way to win. A second argument is that there's actually a lot of research going into play right now about how do you reduce the amount of data that's necessary to train a proficient AI system, right? And this field is advancing very quickly. You know, not every company is Google, so there's a lot of interest in trying to find ways of training good AI systems with less data. And so part of our fear here is that you erect this enormous edifice of export controls around semiconductors, only to discover that some grad student has released a paper which says, hey, you can train AI systems with a lot less data now, right? In which case, the whole ability for this to block rival progress suddenly goes up in smoke. Another big concern. And then I think the final one, which is something I hope we go into a little bit more, is that frequently we have conflated machine learning from competition over artificial intelligence. What's the distinction I'm trying to draw? Well, AI is basically the task of trying to give machines the ability to have sort of cognitive capabilities that we associate with human intelligence. Machine learning is a very particular way that we found to do it over the last 10, 15 years. And there's kind of an argument which is, okay, maybe semiconductors are a good way of delaying rival progress in machine learning, but they actually may be kind of a rough tool to try to prevent rival progress in AI writ large. So one example here is that there's a lot of interest in the machine learning field around what's known as sort of causal inference. Can you teach machines the ability to understand causality? Kind of an important skill that you might want to teach a computer in the future and would unlock a lot of different capabilities. A lot of that's dependent right now on theoretical advancements versus advancements in just simply pouring more data and compute into the problem, right? And so I think for all these three reasons, we sort of ultimately land on the conclusion that, look, this is almost a way of maybe delaying progress in a quite narrow area of the machine learning field and might actually be kind of a very brittle tool for doing so. And so I think for the specific reasons of the details in the machine learning field, we ultimately say actually all three of these are poor candidates for export controls. So just a couple of bits of thought there on kind of our analysis on applying these lessons to contemporary technology. And so before we go into discussion, I think Emily wanted to kind of review the hot topic of the day, right? Which is, of course, what do we think about the export controls that just went into effect?
Yeah, so we'll run through these really quickly because I think we really want to focus on the Q&A here. But I wanted to obviously kind of bring up the elephant in the room here, which is these new controls that ostensibly are built around this idea of slowing China's progress in artificial intelligence based on that compute lever that Tim was just talking about. So quickly, and I'm going to say here, this is not supposed to be, again, a comprehensive review of these new controls. For those who know, there are 139 pages. They're incredibly dense, incredibly complex, and will take folks like myself a couple of weeks to really fully digest them. But just to go over really quickly, the new controls that came out on October 7th are designed to limit the development and production in China of these following things. So we're looking at advanced node semiconductors, semiconductor production equipment, advanced computing capabilities, and supercomputers. And those are, we're controlling those based on some of the kind of traditional authorities that the US government and the Department of Commerce have. Oh, and there's that. So I do want to highlight though that there are two aspects of the new controls that are relatively novel. One is one that regulates the activities of US persons, even if all of the items in question are foreign and uncontrolled. The second part regulates the shipment from outside of the US of foreign-made items to specific end uses and end users, related to, again, this idea of controlling for advanced compute, advanced node semiconductors, or supercomputers. So again, really focused on this idea of pausing China or stopping China at a certain threshold for compute power. And I want to just quickly, so again, for those who have looked at the regulations, you'll see that a lot of them are crafted around this idea of supercomputers in China being used for purposes of WMDs, and there's some stuff in there about, again, artificial intelligence for human rights. Obviously, for those who kind of are more familiar with the regulation or the rulemaking process here, export controls have traditionally been designed for the purposes of regulating conventional weapons and WMDs. So for the sake of making things easier, both for the US, for the Department of Commerce, as well as making it easier for allies to digest a lot of this, it was stuck in this idea, again, of WMDs and more conventional weapons. But what's really interesting actually is to put these new controls in the context of a kind of broader messaging that's coming from the Biden administration. And I won't go through and read this, but this is a quote from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan from about a month ago at the Special Competitive Studies Project Global Summit, where he talks about this idea of shifting the way we approach semiconductors, or how we approach export controls, particularly in semiconductors, away from this idea of maintaining a sliding scale approach where we keep China a few generations behind us and behind the leading edge, to kind of, because of this foundational nature of export of of chips, and he specifically calls out advanced logic and memory chips, we have to actually rethink what we're doing and maybe think about pausing them or keeping the Chinese at a threshold that's a little further back. So his last point about maintaining as large of a lead as possible. So I'll pass it to Tim to just quickly review here the potential policy effects and risks of this new policy, and then we'll wrap up.
Great. So I think just a quick note on this, particularly for people who work in the AI policy space like myself, I think there's a tendency to believe that AI is kind of the center of the national security universe. It just turns out not to be, of course, right? That actually you make national security decisions with AI kind of being maybe the fifth priority if you get to it in the meeting. And so I think it's important to kind of zoom out for a second as we think about the risks of policy, and think a little bit not just about its impact on AI competition, right? Because I think that may actually really have the tail wagging the dog here, right? And there's two of the risks that we point out here, which I think are part of all sort of export control policies, but I think are relevant here, right? So this is points 2 and 3. The first one is basically that you'll see what happened in the satellite case occur in the semiconductor space, right? That increasingly that supply chains will shift relatively quickly. And what you end up with is basically a market for sort of US free semiconductors. Now, I think we can debate about sort of how likely that is to happen. I think reasonable minds can differ, but I think it's a genuine risk here. And the notion that essentially the supply chain can't shift very quickly is essentially a bet on against sort of the fluidity of the global economy. So I think in some ways I'm sort of skeptical of that argument. The second one is particularly given how this policy is scoped, there's a real question about its sort of damage to kind of US relations, right? Are you putting allies in a situation where they sort of have to decide between these two poles? And ultimately, are the kind of economic interests in the semiconductor supply chain going to be powerful enough to actually move some allies away from you? I think that's another risk to be concerned about. And then I think the final one, which is kind of the top item here, or second item here, sort of change the order a little bit, really is around AI and what we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? Which is that we often think about AI as kind of this fixed thing. And I think this is something I've been thinking a lot about is we should think about AI as actually part of a class of technologies that we call emerging technologies. And what's notable about those emerging technologies is they change so frequently, right? And I'm kind of willing to bet to basically say, look, what we've learned about AI in the last 15 years may just not hold for the next 15 years. And if that's the case, we can really believe that the practice of AI may change in ways that invalidate a lot of our assumptions about why semiconductors are a good lever for fighting even just this narrow competition around AI. So a couple of risks that are worth pointing out.
I will go back just for a second to also talk about the potential policy effects too. I think these are also super important. And again, this stuff is all fairly new, so it's hard to say where things are going. But there is a very strong potential that that these new policies, especially as they go into effect and we kind of start to see where they're going, that they could actually have some real crippling effects on certain aspects of the Chinese semiconductor supply chain, particularly in instances related to companies that are working at very specific parts of the memory chip supply chain, or ones that are working or that require access to a very specific type of semiconductor production equipment that can only come, via either a U.S. source or via a third party or third country source that has U.S. origin technology in it. So I do think that we will see some struggles on the Chinese side, and I think we'll see some pretty significant struggles. We also may see, again, this could have the potential to stymie Chinese progress in AI. As Tim said, we're kind of we kind of push back on this idea that it could have a long-term effect on Chinese progress in AI. But for at least a couple of years, I do think that it could put the Chinese back a little bit further. And again, just to that point, we think about as opposed to this previous sliding scale model, we're now trying to ensure that China does not improve past the point that we have laid out. And so I won't go into the very technical sides of the policies here. But instead of assuming that, okay, we'll let China get access to the latest and greatest technology once it's 2 or 3 years out of date, we're just essentially just putting up a wall indefinitely. So what we may see here is, well, we've actually never done this before, so it's a little bit of an experiment, but this might actually have some stronger effects than policies we've seen in the past. So just to wrap up, I think kind of a few key points, and again, these are just reiterating a few things that Tim and I have already talked about. The two lessons, again, that we've drawn from the satellite case study are the ones revolving around the characteristics of the technology that's being controlled, as well as the concentration of the supply chain. I think those are kind of the two big takeaways here. Tim, I don't know if you want to cover the last two more specifically in AI.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that again, to read ultimately the arguments that we made, I think one of them is compute is sort of this attractive lever, but I think we should be wary to use it just because it's the easy lever to use, right? I think is the message I would want the audience to take away. And then I think the final one is really kind of like the importance of data in the space as well, right? Because I think, as Igor and I were talking about not too long ago, right? Like now the policy's been implemented, right? We have to think a little bit about how it can be best implemented. And I think a big part of that is knowing what's actually happening out there in the economy. And so as per usual, and again, I think this is a very CSET note to end on, is we need more data. And it's actually like incredibly key in terms of trying to figure out, like, is this policy well calibrated? Do we need to go further? Do we need to pull back? We can only have an intelligent policy discussion if we have those facts. So that's a perennial recommendation, but I think an important one.
Yeah. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this last slide, but Tim and I also want to remind everyone that export controls are not the only tool in our toolbox. There are so many other things to consider, both in terms of the kind of run faster or promote or industrial policy side, as well as more on the protect and defend side. So other tools like sanctions and other things like IP protection, as well as domestic support, things like the recently passed Chips and Science Act, and so on and so forth. So with that, pass it over to Martin.
Thank you both. That was excellent. Let's start and dig in on this issue of compute as a lever, right? So you obviously expressed there's potential risks with that. Now, at present, though, the compute required for the final training run of the machine learning model doubles about every 10 months. So given that, given what the administration did and the timing of their actions, that initially strikes me as if your goal is to constrain your competitors' ability to catch up or even degrade their capability overall, that strikes me as a pretty powerful lever as opposed to a narrow one, as you described. Can you elaborate a bit on your thinking on these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So for my response here, I'm going to draw on some of the work that I believe Micah was pushing ahead, which I think is actually really relevant to this discussion. So there's a little bit of a worry that I have with the kind of most recent rules that have been launched, which is that we might have basically decided to target the compute lever just as it becomes less important to the AI story. The reason being is because if you look at the progress in AI over the last X number of years, right, a lot of that has been driven by access to more data and access to more compute. But part of the thing that we're finding is that the amount of compute resources you need to make progress is getting to the point where these trends actually make it infeasible for compute to continue to be the main lever you're going to use to progress on AI. So, one argument you could make, right, is, okay, we've decided to kind of block access here, but it turns out that the next wave of competition on AI is going to be advancing things other than simply adding more machines to the mix. And if that's the case, right, then, there's almost a worry which is like, okay, here but no farther, but it just turns out that you didn't need to go any further to really try to make the next kind of like step change progress in the technology. And again, I think like part of this is trying to bet around what you think the future of this tech is going to look like. But I guess I tend to believe that this tech is actually much more malleable because it is in an early phase of its development versus something that we're talking about like at a much further level of maturity.
Do you think the U.S. government's tech forecasting capacity is good enough to be able to determine when the right time would be to pull a lever like that?
I'm not too familiar with the current.
So I would argue that probably not. I think a lot of the stuff that's happening right now in emerging technologies is happening outside of a classified space. So a lot of folks in, for instance, the intelligence community or folks who are usually used to tracking this stuff in semi-classified spaces don't often have access to like the big data sets that are often expensive, academic data sets, patents, all that type of information that can actually help folks get a better idea and forecast where things are going in emerging technologies. So I know CSET in the past, I know our director, Dewey Murdoch, has advocated for creating some type of open source science and technology analytical center that exists outside of the intelligence community, but can pull on expertise both from within the US government and from industry and outside the US government. So I think something like that would be really salient here.
Let's go back to the point you made about ITAR-free satellites, right? So the designing out US content from those systems. So tell me a bit about how you see the potential for AI R&D to be done without US tech components know-how, and how would that come about if you do think it's feasible?
So I think there are two pieces of it. One is on the talent side. So one of the big points of these new controls is a new control that's related to services or activities of US persons that are working in this space related to the production of certain types of advanced chips or chips that are going towards supercomputers or being used in China and sent to fabs for that type of activity. There are now new controls that regulate if a US person, for instance, is working at the Dutch company ASML to help customers in China, that activity now technically requires a license. So in this sense, I almost am thinking of a future instead of ITAR-free satellites, I'm thinking of US-free workforces in some of these supply chains. I think that's one thing that as we go forward and as US government is monitoring the effectiveness of this policy, we need to make sure that we're watching that to see if some of the companies around the world are starting to decide that, you know, it's not worth having to go through the kind of pain process of getting people approved for licenses to do stuff with China, or even just to deal with kind of separating those two groups of the workforce. So they might decide that, you know, we're just going to go with talent from other places. In terms of the actual equipment, I'm more skeptical of the idea of China being able to produce like wholly indigenous Chinese chips at scale. And I think we've seen recent examples of, particularly at the most advanced levels, China has shown that they can almost get there, but they usually, you know, can't produce something at scale, or have kind of like jerry-rigged something and it works for this, but might not work for that. What I'm more worried about, I would say, is on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the item side, where there is, I would say, less of a learning curve associated with, for instance, a Chinese company wanting to create the software or create a version of the software that companies like Cadence or Synopsys are using to help design chips. There's much less of a learning curve with that, as opposed to the Chinese, for instance, wanting to try and wholly indigenize EUV photolithography machines, which, as we know, the Chinese, I think there's a great quote from one of my other CSET colleagues, works, Ben Murphy, where he says that a general manager from a Chinese chip company said pretty much, even if ASML handed us the blueprints to these chips or to these EUV photolithography machines, we still would not be able to replicate them because of the lack of the tacit knowledge that we have that ASML has built up over decades. So I think there are certain places where we could see the Chinese try to fill those gaps and create those ITAR-free. And actually, I shouldn't say just the Chinese. I think there are places where potentially allies and partners, or companies and allied and partner nations, could also decide that the lure of the Chinese market actually outweighs that of the US market. So they're going to go that way and try to manufacture out things. But I would say that it will be easier in some instances than in others.
Tim, any thoughts?
No, I think it's great.
So two of our online guests both raised questions about this US person provision that's in the export control. So Dieter Ernst of the East-West Center expressed concern about what that means for innovative capacity. And perhaps you could elaborate on this. So Robert Netchie's asked about what you meant by that being such a key change. How can you give a bit of context as to why that US person provision is such a big deal?
Yeah, so as to why it's such a big deal, so this part of the regulation has always technically existed, and actually in the ITAR space in the State Department with munitions and defense articles, there's always been this type of if you are a U.S. person that is, you know, supporting something overseas or with a foreign company or something, you've always kind of needed approval from the Department of State to do that. In the context of export controls, and in the context of these export controls, what's novel about this is that in this case, I would point out folks may be familiar with this idea of deemed exports. What they actually did here is specifically carve out deemed exports. So they are not included in here, and they went with the support of US persons thing. And I think this is really interesting because what this does is it removes this like question of nationality or ethnicity or loyalty to a specific country in thinking about these controls. So there's been some kind of confusion about whether or not, is this going to really affect the folks who are of Chinese ethnicity, or I'm sorry, in this case, it's US persons. So people who are dual citizens, people who are of Chinese ethnicity or Chinese heritage. And what I would actually argue is the way that they have carved this out, and I would say kudos to the interagency, especially the Department of Commerce for doing this so well, is what they did actually is get rid of that. So really this could apply to anyone, to your John Smith, who is working at ASML on technology that is being exported to a semiconductor fab that's working on a specific type of flash memory chips. So what it's done, I would say, is really kind of create this big overarching idea of like a foreign direct product rule or an extraterritorial control, but in the context of people and not items. And that's something we haven't seen before. So that's kind of the big overview of the difference there.
Excellent, excellent. So Tim, you made a very interesting comment during the presentation about the distinction between the competition in AI and the competition in machine learning. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think we often forget that, AI is like this very broad field, and there's been a lot of work on it over many, many decades. And in some ways, machine learning has come to dominate our understanding of it, in part just because it has had such dramatic success, effectively, over the last like 10, 15 years. And I think what we want to do in the paper, but what I genuinely believe, is that we kind of have to open up the aperture again, right? That when we talk about competition around AI, we should genuinely be talking about competition around AI versus simply talking competition around machine learning. Or if we are talking about machine learning, being sort of like precise in our terms. And the reason that's important is because I think ultimately we have to keep sort of the eye on the ball, right? Which is, okay, what's more important, machine learning or AI? And I would say ultimately from a national competition standpoint, the question is, which nation will be the first to sort of lead in giving computers all sorts of cognitive capabilities, right? And I think I happen to believe that what we are finding with the machine learning case is that it's incredibly good at generating very precise kinds of capabilities, right? You want to do object recognition? Great. You want to generate text? Awesome, right? But there's also some very severe limitations in what our current sort of design of doing machine learning can do. And so, again, reasonable minds can differ, but I think my critique is that ultimately this is kind of like a limited thing, right? And that if we're concerned about kind of competition around AI or artificial intelligence more broadly, we kind of have to have an aperture that says, okay, this is more than just simply data, compute, semiconductors. And I think that broader competition is the bigger thing that we're in, not really competition around what has been sort of successful or hot in the last decade.
I would just add really quickly too, I think another big piece of this, because we have to take this step back and think about artificial intelligence more broadly. I think this is the first time in a long time, even first time ever, that in the context of export controls, we've actually had to sit back and think about the economic implications. And in most cases, when we as the US government have deployed export controls, we've assumed that the national security implications are so intense, are so important, or so urgent that whatever the economic considerations are, they don't matter here. Whereas in this case, I think we're in a really different scenario where we actually have to sit back and watch over the next few weeks, months, years to see what happens, to see if we do start to see indicators of, for instance, companies trying to take the ITAR-free satellite route with chips, or do we see the same thing happening with talent? Do we see companies deciding to let go of their US talent in favor of talent from other countries? I think it's also important to sit back and monitor some of the US companies that are potentially affected by these controls, things like NVIDIA, AMD, or even some of the companies that are attached to the semiconductor production equipment side of things. I think monitoring them for economic competitiveness reasons is super important for us going forward, because if we're assuming that in this case a healthy and economically prosperous chip industry in the US, and I would say with allied countries, is important for national security, then I think we really need to be paying attention to that. And I think right now in US government, I don't necessarily know if we have the capabilities or the infrastructure set up to actually do that monitoring process in a rigorous and really in a rigorous fashion.
Yeah, one final thought too is, one fascinating possibility that I've been thinking about with these new export controls is that, say they are really successful, you actually could imagine a world where what AI means in different countries actually diverges quite significantly over time, right? So the Chinese say, okay, well, I can't get access to doing AI in this particular way. What else could I be investing in, right? Whereas actually in the US, like the momentum is still in a very particular way of doing machine learning. That becomes the major bit of expertise. And so you might actually imagine these kind of forking paths, right? And then it ends up being this very, very interesting debate, which is what are the capabilities in AI do you think actually make a difference, say, in a military domain, right? And is it going to be what's happening in machine learning? That's like a very context-specific question, but I think worth considering, right? Which is like, we're making this bet, but the question is like, things don't stay stable, right? And the question is like, do we see enough divergence over time that, actually maybe it turns out that when we should have been searching over here, right? Instead, we're just going with what worked at the point at which we made the export controls.
Thomas Grosbeck has questions on U.S. academia, so how U.S. universities fit into this. I think the question is not just how it impacts U.S. research universities and U.S.-China scientific collaboration, but more broadly, could that affect other foreign researchers wanting to or not wanting to work with U.S. academic institutions?
So to be honest, it's a good question. The way I understand it now is that, well, for the most part, so export controls in the US, we're talking about research and academia. We have the fundamental research exclusion. So if two academics in the US are collaborating on any type of work, or if someone publishes something, the second it is published, it is automatically excluded from export controls. And there's a whole host of reasons for this, and this debate goes back to the Reagan administration. But we have this set up both for, I would say, First Amendment reasons, but also to kind of promote our values here, where in the US, we really value our open and collaborative academic environment. So right now, I don't necessarily know what this effect will have on academia. My guess is if you take it really literally and try to say, okay, what do these controls mean for academia? Probably means very little. I would say in the broader context of US-China tech competition, I think, where we've seen concerns around US academics here in the US who are dual citizens with China or of Chinese ethnicity and have been facing a lot of scrutiny or perceived scrutiny via things like the Department of Justice's China Initiative and other efforts to target Chinese espionage here in the US. I feel like this could potentially add fuel to the fire just based on the narrative, but just based on, again, reading the controls themselves, I think these are mainly focused again on companies and on specific exports here. And we're talking about those services. I think, again, we're talking about people in the corporate settings.
Yeah, I wonder whether one outcome of these policies may actually be finally create the momentum for like a true national research computing cloud. The reason being is, right, the topology of machine learning as it has been done, right, is largely the fact that like universities have fallen behind. Like if you want to do cutting edge research in the space, you rely on private companies because they have the compute, they have the data. That's led to basically a lot of machine learning academics having curious and many entanglements with private companies of various kinds, which can bring them sort of afoul with some of these policies ultimately. And I think one of the interesting things, I guess, is like whether or not the fact that has become suddenly a lot more risky produces a lot more incentive to say, hey, we actually now have to invest in kind of like a fundamental research cloud, right, that people can actually do their work in, that stands a little bit outside of, right, like the leverage that I think a lot of private companies have had over the space.
I would also add just briefly too, I think we're at a really interesting turning point for the semiconductor workforce here in the United States as well, because as we have this potential for companies outside of the US to start shedding their US person talent or their US person workforce, this is a great opportunity to see really those promote and protect policies working in tandem, where as we put in these new controls, we start to have places in the United States where that talent can come and immediately get started, whether that's in US companies, in academia, all these types of things. So making sure that we're ready to welcome them back with open arms, I think is a really, really important piece of this. So.
Rael Barrett had an interesting question, and it pertains to our visibility into Chinese advances in AI. So did we just put blinders on ourselves, or did we just create a black box where we don't understand what China is pursuing when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Well, that's just Emily. I mean, I think by default, our visibility is not very good, particularly in the open source. And so I guess the question is whether or not the policy has made it any more opaque, which I think potentially, yeah, I think so, right? But I guess on margin, I'm not sure, like if you're already blindfolded, it's already hard to see. And so I don't know if the addition of another blindfold actually makes it any more harder to see, you know? That's kind of where I'm at, but Emily's actually done like the work here, so yeah.
No, I would agree with that. And I think one of the other pieces of this, I think going forward, if we are going to put these blinders on ourselves or further increase the opacity of our blinders, I think what we really need to do is really rely on our allies and partners, especially those that are key parts of the semiconductor supply chain, South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands, among others, Taiwan. I think what we really need to do is work with them because they will have insight into what is happening in China, both in terms of just the interconnectedness of their supply chains with China. And my guess is that their supply chains, because of their kind of the trade relationships that they have with China, will probably stay closer than what we have with China, especially going forward. They also, again, will be able to provide some of that insight. So creating mechanisms for whether that be formal or informal information sharing, making sure that we are staying up to date with them and making sure that we also lean on them for getting that information, I think is really important. Because I do think it could potentially be very dangerous for us going forward if we completely lose sight of what's happening in China. And there's also something to be said about continuing some of the sales or exports to China of US origin chips, even at the most mature nodes, or even some of the equipment, also just to maintain that leverage over China. I think there's a lot of work in the academic community about this idea of weaponized interdependence. And I think there's something to be said, like I said, about continuing to force China to rely on us for certain parts of the supply chain. I think that can be really powerful.
So you just raised a key point, Emily, right? That other countries, including some of our key allies, continue to have strong trade relationships with China. And so Rebecca Arcasati raised the point of the risk that foreign companies may choose to double down on China's semiconductor ecosystem. To what extent, Tim and Emily, do you see these companies being able to help China achieve its indigenization goals? Because a lot of these export controls don't directly impact companies like ASML, Tokyo Electron, and others. How worried should we be about that?
Yeah, what you see with things like ASML is that you have expertise in a very particular slice of the supply chain. And I think the question is really an interesting one, which is, okay, do these export controls create market opportunities for those players in this particular slice to like vertically or horizontally integrate in the space to basically say, okay, well, I have less competitors now on the next phase of the production process. And so I can start offering that as a service. I think it's very possible. This is going to be a very unsatisfying answer. I think it depends very much on the economics of each particular layer of the supply chain. And to Emily's comment before we started, there's like a handful of people that really know that. I'm not one of them. So.
But no, I mean, just to kind of double down on what Tim just said too. I think it's not only the economics of the specific technologies we're talking about, it's the characteristics of those specific technologies. So to go back to that example about in some areas that learning curve is steeper than others, I think there are places potentially where China themselves might be looking and saying, okay, look, so it's probably easier for us to catch up in this type of software or in this type of manufacturing equipment, but in this one, we need to cut our losses and find another way around because we understand that we're not going to be able to achieve that. And the Chinese are very actively studying these things. And like I said, the choke points paper that I mentioned earlier really dives into how much the Chinese academic and policy community is looking at where their specific weaknesses and strengths are, particularly in chips. But what I would say in terms of following this with allies, I don't necessarily think in all cases that some of our allies and partners and companies there are going to actively choose. Well, in some cases, maybe they might, but in others, I don't think they're necessarily going to actively choose to pick the US or China. I think China can have an active role here in potentially incentivizing or coercing or making it more difficult or easier for certain companies to operate in China based on what the Chinese view as their choke points and kind of where they see an ongoing reliance on that foreign technology. So I think it really depends. But I think going forward, we really need to be upfront and have those really important clarifying questions with allies to make sure that they understand what we're trying to do. They understand that we are not trying to target them. We are, we have to get them on board with the same objective here. And I think that boils down to this idea, we had on the last slide, the important role of diplomacy as a tool in our arsenal. And I think that's a really important one.
I'm going to ask one final question. I'm going to riff off of some questions that Peter Raymond and Omar Pimentel asked. And the question is this: so what should a U.S. strategy for AI competition look like?
I'm glad you asked. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about on the very broad scope of this is that, there's a question about basically like how well is a society able to leverage a given technology? And, I think one of the things I think a little bit about is that AI in some ways is kind of not very well suited for fast implementation in a liberal democracy. The most obvious one to look at here is just like the data demands of these types of models, right? So it's a situation in which in order to get a proficient model, you have to consume a lot of data. That might be sensitive data, right? And so if you have a society that cares a lot, say, about privacy, right? Like there is friction to implementing this technology. And I think there's been two sort of schools of thought, right? I think the dominant school of thought has basically been to say, okay, well then lower the barriers to us getting access to the data. And I think my response to that is a little bit to say, okay, well, are we basically like sacrificing our values as a liberal democracy to try to get ahead in AI? And if so, should we actually, is not the better response here to say, are there technical areas that we could crack that if we did would actually change the nature of the technology, right? So there would be that there's actually a lot of interesting research around, like, can we do privacy preserving AI, right? Can we do a model of AI where we keep all your personal data in the edges of the network and only send these privacy protecting updates into the cloud? And I think all of those things are ways in which we don't necessarily need to sacrifice sort of the technology. And I think it's more than just kind of this high-minded discussion about values, right? Like the thing that you're trying to do here is, can you adjust the technology in a way that allows us to implement and use it at the highest speed possible? And so when I say kind of like, so the questioner's answer is like, what should our strategy in the space be? I guess I would advise kind of less thinking about this technology as a fixed thing, but instead saying, what are the problems that we need to be breaking to make sure that like it actually works for us? And I think that's a strategy that you can take to like a lot of these semiconductor discussions, right? Is to basically say, okay, is this way of doing AI like the way we want the competition to work? And can we shift the playing field so it works better for us? And I think that's kind of generally something that I think is not really in discussion, but should be.
Couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, we will wrap it up right there. Emily, Tim, thank you so much. Congratulations on this fantastic brief. Thank you for presentation and your thoughtful answers. And just wanted to thank everyone in the audience for their questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. Thank you all to everyone who joined us in person here. So we'll see you next time.